The door opened before she could knock. Patricia stood in the doorway, arms crossed, voice cold as stone. "We need you to make other arrangements." Nadine went still, 8 months pregnant, her eyes fixed directly on the older woman's face. "I am 32 weeks along, Patricia, we are aware." She turned to the man standing at the bottom of the staircase, her husband of 7 years, the man who could not bring himself to look her in the eye. "Garrett, say something." He lifted his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am sorry, Nadine." One beat of silence. She asked, her voice steady, not trembling, only sharp and clean. "Is there someone else?" Garrett looked at the floor. That was her answer. She walked out of that house in the dark of night, no income, no plan, no place to go, carrying a child who had not yet taken a single breath in this world. But there was one thing the entire Calloway family never knew about the woman they had just thrown away. This is Nadine's story, and do not look away before you find out what happens next. The click of heels on marble was the first sound she heard. Nadine stood on the front steps of the Calloway house with her hand raised and her knuckles inches from the iron knocker. The October air pressed cold against the back of her neck. The smell of dead leaves and wood smoke drifted from somewhere down the street, sweet and ordinary, the kind of smell that should have meant a quiet evening and nothing more. The door opened before she could knock. That was the first strange thing. Patricia Calloway stood in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest, and her chin lifted slightly and her eyes doing that thing. That specific arrangement of features that Nadine had spent 7 years learning to read and had never been able to name but had always known to fear. Nadine let her hand drop to her side. "We need to talk," Patricia said. Not hello. Not come in, dear. Not a single glance at the place where Nadine's coat was pulled tight across her stomach, round and heavy at 32 weeks, pressing against the only waistband that still fit. Just those 4 words, flat and prepared. "Okay," Nadine said. She kept her voice quiet. She kept it even. She had trained herself to do that around Patricia, the way you train yourself not to flinch when someone raises a hand near your face. Slow and careful and requiring daily practice. "Should I come inside?" Patricia stepped back. Just enough, a fraction of an invitation. The foyer smelled like lemon polish and cut flowers, white lilies in a crystal vase on the entry table. Nadine had chosen those lilies herself 3 years ago, during the brief season when she had been allowed to have opinions about this house, before Patricia reclaimed the decorating, the dinner menus, the guest lists, and eventually, quietly, everything else. The click of different heels on the stairs. Nadine turned. Garrett was standing at the base of the staircase, her husband, the father of the child she was carrying. The man she had loved since she was 26 years old, when he walked into a nonprofit gala where she worked the registration table and told her, with absolute ease, that she had the most serious eyes he had ever seen. He was not looking at her the way he had looked at her then. He was looking at the floor. "Garrett," she said. His name came out smaller than she intended. "What is going on?" He said nothing. His jaw moved. His hands were in his pockets. He had changed from the clothes he wore that morning, the blue shirt she had ironed and the gray slacks, into something different. Something she did not recognize. That was the second strange thing. "Sit down," Patricia said, behind her. Nadine did not sit down. She turned slowly because quick movements hurt now, because the baby pressed against her ribs when she moved too fast. "Tell me what is happening," she said. Patricia drew a breath, long and deliberate. The breath of a woman who has rehearsed something until it became smooth. "Garrett has made a decision," Patricia said. "We all support him. This is his home, his family's home. We think it would be best for everyone if you made other arrangements." The words settled in Nadine's mind. She parsed them once. She parsed them twice. "Make other arrangements. I am sorry," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Proud of the steadiness, because nothing else in the room was steady at all. "Are you telling me to leave?" "We are asking you to be reasonable," Patricia said. "I am 32 weeks pregnant," Nadine said. "We are aware," Patricia said. The clock on the mantel ticked, ticked, ticked. Nadine looked at her husband. "Garrett," she said. He looked up, finally, and what she saw in his face was not guilt exactly. It was something worse than guilt. It was the face of a man who has already made his peace with what he is doing. A man who has moved internally to the next chapter. A man who is simply waiting for the current one to end. "I am sorry, Nadine," he said. 3 words, soft, almost kind. And somehow that softness was the worst thing she had heard in 7 years of marriage. She had thought, when she imagined this moment, because she had imagined it many times, at 3 in the morning on her side of the bed while he slept, she had thought she would cry, or yell, or say something devastating that she would later regret. She did none of those things. She put her hand on her stomach, just rested it there, the way she did when the baby kicked, the way she did when she was frightened. Pure instinct, pure animal mother instinct. "Is there someone else?" she asked. Patricia made a sound. Not quite a laugh. A dismissal dressed as a sound. Garrett's eyes dropped again. There it was. Of course there was. She had known for months. The late nights that smelled like someone else's perfume. The phone that went face down whenever she entered a room. The way he had stopped reaching for her in bed. And the way she had told herself it was work stress. It was the pregnancy. It was just a phase that every marriage went through. The signs had all been there. She had just needed the courage to finally read them. Who, she asked. That is not relevant right now, Patricia started. Who, Nadine said again, and this time her voice was not soft. Garrett lifted his eyes and held hers. Celeste, he said. Celeste, she knew that name. Celeste Hartman, 31 years old, daughter of Warren Hartman, one of the senior partners at the firm where Garrett had worked for 4 years. The woman who attended their anniversary dinner last spring. The woman who touched Garrett's arm when she laughed. The woman who said to Nadine, with what seemed like absolute sincerity, "What a beautiful couple you two make." Beautiful couple. The room tilted very slightly around its edges. Nadine held very still. "I see," she said. "The house," Garrett began, "is in both our names," she said. That stopped him. "I will need some time," she said, "to make arrangements." She used Patricia's word deliberately, watched her mother-in-law blink. "Of course," Patricia said, "we are not unreasonable." Nadine looked at her husband one more time. He was already looking away. She turned and walked to the door. Her coat was still on. She had never taken it off. Her purse was on her shoulder. She opened the door herself, stepped out into the October air, and pulled it closed behind her. The click of the latch was very quiet. She made it to her car, sat down, put both hands on the steering wheel, stared at the garage door across the driveway. She did not cry, not yet. She just sat there in the dark. The engine was off. The heat was already fading. One hand eventually moved back to her stomach. "You know this already," she thought. "You have known for a long time. You just stopped letting yourself know it." "Okay," she said softly. To herself, to the baby, to nobody at all. "Okay." The clock on the dashboard said 7:43 in the evening. She had nowhere to go. She drove anyway. The roads were quiet on a Tuesday night. She passed the pharmacy where she picked up her prenatal vitamins, the coffee shop where she used to meet her college friend Caroline every other Thursday, the hospital where she had her appointments, where in 8 weeks she would walk in and walk out a different person entirely. She drove for a long time without thinking about where she was going. Then she stopped not thinking and pulled into the parking lot of a closed garden center and sat with her forehead against the steering wheel. 7 years. She had given that man 7 years. She had left her job at the nonprofit, the career she loved, the work that made her feel useful, because he had asked her to, because the travel was hard on the relationship, because he had said, "We will start a family soon, and I want you home." She had moved into the orbit of the Calloway family with their marble foyer and their lemon polish smell and their very particular way of looking at her when she used the wrong fork. She had tried to become the woman they wanted, had shrunk herself a fraction at a time so carefully she had almost not noticed. Almost. She sat in that parking lot for a long time. Then she took out her phone, stared at it, and called the only person she could think of. It rang twice. Nadine? Her older sister, Ruth, answered with the particular alertness of someone who knows a call at this hour means trouble. "What happened?" Nadine opened her mouth, and then she cried. Not the small, controlled kind of crying, the real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below words, somewhere deep in the body, somewhere that does not care about composure or timing or what it sounds like. She cried until she could speak again. Then she told Ruth everything. Ruth's apartment was warm. It smelled like cinnamon and old paperbacks and the particular mellow scent of a well-loved dog. Walter, Ruth's ancient basset hound, hauled himself off his bed when Nadine came through the door and pressed his enormous head against her knee with wordless and complete solidarity. Ruth made tea, said nothing while Nadine talked, let her go all the way through it, from the knock on the door to the drive to the parking lot, without interrupting once. Then she said, very carefully, "I need you to say that again. They told you to leave. While you are pregnant." "Yes," Nadine said, and Garrett just stood there. "Yes," Nadine said. Ruth wrapped both hands around her mug. Her knuckles were white. "Okay," she said, with the specific calmness of someone suppressing something enormous. "Okay, you are staying here. That is settled. Do you need anything from the house?" "My things. The nursery." "I do not." Nadine pressed a hand against her eyes. "I do not know where to start." "You start with a lawyer," Ruth said. "Tomorrow morning." Her voice had gone iron-wrapped in velvet. "Tonight you sleep. Can you eat something?" Nadine realized she had not eaten since noon. "Yes," she said. "I think I can." Walter heaved himself onto the couch beside her, which he was not supposed to do, and Ruth pretended not to notice. Nadine leaned against his warm, ridiculous weight and felt the baby kick hard twice, insistent, as if to say, "I am still here. I am still here. Do not forget me." The kicks felt like something solid in an evening that had nothing solid left in it. She fell asleep on Ruth's couch at 10:30, still in her coat, with Walter's warmth against her side and one hand resting on her stomach. She slept better than she had in a year. The lawyer's name was Vivian Marsh. She was 53 years old, had steel gray hair cut very short, and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She came recommended by Ruth, who got the name from her friend Constance, who had been through what Ruth called her situation 4 years ago and come out the other side with her dignity in her house and most of her original furniture. Vivian's office smelled like coffee and paper. Not the sharp smell of a place trying to impress, but the settled smell of real work happening over a long time. Stacks of files covered the side credenza. Somehow Nadine suspected Vivian knew the exact contents of every one of them without looking. Nadine sat down, folded her hands on the table, and told her story again. Vivian listened, made notes. Did not interrupt except to ask 3 specific questions in a row. How long had they been married? Whose name was on the mortgage? And had Nadine signed any prenuptial agreement before the wedding? 7 years, Nadine said, both names, and no. Vivian set her pen aside. Here is where we are, she said. Your husband cannot remove you from the marital home. What he and his mother did last night was legally meaningless. You have every right to return to that house today. Nadine stared at her. Seriously, Vivian said. Now, I understand you may not want to live there under those circumstances. That is your choice. But he cannot evict you from a jointly owned property. She picked up her pen again. What concerns me more in terms of your immediate situation is protecting your assets and your parental rights. Do you have independent financial accounts? Nadine thought of the savings account she had maintained, quietly, since leaving her job. Not much by most standards, but hers. Money she had managed carefully and told herself was for emergencies and had never touched. Some, she said. Good, Vivian said. Move what you can today before he thinks to freeze anything. Not all of it, that could look punitive, but enough to live on for the next few months. A pause. Do you have income? And here was the thing. Here was the thing Nadine had not said out loud to anyone, because it had arrived in the mail 6 weeks ago, and she had not known how to think about it, let alone how to speak it into the world. My great-uncle died, she said. My grandfather's brother. His name was Everett Whitmore. He lived in Vermont. We were not close. I saw him maybe 5 or 6 times in my whole life. Vivian waited. Her pen was still. Her attention was complete. He had no children, Nadine said slowly. No wife. He built a software company in the 1990s. Sold it. Invested. Built another one. Sold that too. Then invested the proceeds very quietly for 25 years. She cleared her throat. He left most of his estate to various charities, but there was a personal trust. And according to the letter I received, she opened her purse, took out the folded document she had been carrying for 6 weeks like a piece of evidence she did not yet know what to do with. She slid it across the desk. Vivian picked it up. Read it. Her expression did not change. She was, Nadine suspected, a woman whose expression rarely changed in professional settings. But something shifted very slightly behind her eyes. A small recalibration. She set the paper down. $14 billion, Vivian said. Yes, Nadine said. This has been confirmed, Vivian said. Not a question. I have the estate attorney's contact, a man named Franklin. I called him after the letter arrived. It has been confirmed. Nadine folded her hands together again. I have not told anyone. Not Garrett. Not his family. Not even Ruth. She paused. I was trying to figure out what it meant. What to do with it. Vivian looked at her for a long moment over the tops of her reading glasses. It means a great deal, she said slowly, in terms of your legal position. But more importantly, she set the document aside. It changes nothing about what happened to you last night, and it changes nothing about what you deserve. We are going to proceed the same way we would have proceeded without it. Protect you. Protect your child. Get you what is fair. Something in Nadine's chest loosened. She had not realized she had been bracing for the lawyer to treat her differently, to become more careful, more formal, to rearrange her attention around the money rather than the woman sitting in front of her. Thank you, Nadine said. Do not thank me yet. This is going to be a process. Vivian picked up her pen. Now, let us talk about the child. Custody arrangements begin now, not after the birth. You are at 32 weeks. You have time to establish a legal framework before things become complicated. She looked over her glasses. What do you want, Nadine, in terms of this child, in terms of your future? Tell me exactly what you want. Nadine thought about it. Not about Garrett. Not about Patricia and the marble foyer and the lilies and the dismissal dressed up in the language of reasonableness. She thought about what she, Nadine Louise Whitmore, actually wanted. She had not been asked that question in a very long time. I want my child to have a father, she said, a real one. Whatever our situation becomes, I want that door to remain open if he is willing. She paused, but I want full decision-making authority on education, healthcare, everything that matters for this child's life. Vivian wrote that down. And for yourself, she said. I want my house, Nadine said, or a fair portion of the equity if we sell it. I want to go back to work. My old organization has reached out twice in the last year. I want to rebuild that career. She looked up directly. And I want Garrett Calloway to understand clearly what he had and what he chose to give away. Vivian looked up. Not as punishment, Nadine said quickly. I mean that. I do not want to punish him. I just want him to know. When he is ready to know it, she looked at the window. And I think eventually he will be. There was a pause. He may not, Vivian said. Gently but honestly. I know that, Nadine said. But I would like to leave room for it anyway. They worked for 2 hours after that. By the end, Nadine had a list of actions for that afternoon, a signed retainer agreement, and the name of a financial advisor who specialized in sudden estate inheritance. She stood to leave. At the door, she stopped. One more thing, she said. The inheritance. I would like to keep it private for as long as possible. Vivian studied her, the long, assessing look of a woman who has seen many people make many choices in this office. In my experience, she said slowly, that is often the wisest possible approach. Yes, Nadine said. I thought so too. She called the estate attorney Franklin that afternoon, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table, Walter pressing his enormous head against her knee. Franklin explained the full terms again, quietly and precisely. $14.3 billion in assets, liquid holdings, real estate, equity positions spanning multiple sectors. It would take 18 months to fully transfer and organize. She would have access to a monthly distribution within 60 days. She thanked him and hung up. Then she just sat there, $14 billion. She tried to feel something recognizable. Excitement, perhaps. Relief. The satisfying pop of a problem being solved. What she felt instead was very tired, and very clear-headed, and strangely, unexpectedly calm. She had been afraid, in the parking lot of the garden center, that she had nothing. No income, no home, no plan. No one in her corner except Ruth, who loved her fiercely but could not fix this. She had been wrong. She had resources she had not known existed yesterday morning. She had a sister 2 miles away. She had a lawyer who looked at the truth and did not flinch from it. She had a baby who kicked twice whenever the world felt like it was ending, as if to say, I am still here, pay attention. And she had herself. Whatever that woman looked like right now, tired and swollen and betrayed and sitting in her sister's kitchen with a basset hound in her lap, she had herself. Somewhere along the way inside that marriage, she had become nearly invisible. But she was not invisible now. She took out a legal pad and started making a list. The first thing on the list was the house on Elmwood Drive. She went that afternoon. Ruth came with her, which Nadine suspected was protective, and which was in fact simply good company. They drove in Ruth's practical hatchback, parked in front of the house with the blue shutters and the garden that needed deadheading, and sat there for a moment without speaking. The house looked the same as it always had. That was the strange part. It looked completely, stubbornly the same. You ready? Ruth asked. No, Nadine said honestly. Let us go anyway. Garrett was not there. His car was gone. She used her key. The smell of the house hit her first. Coffee and her candles and old books and the particular warmth of a lived-in space. A smell so familiar it hurt to breathe it. She had loved this house. She had put herself into every room of it. She moved through it efficiently. Clothes first. Medications, documents, the practical things that could not wait. Then, more slowly, the things that mattered differently. Her grandmother's quilt, the photo album she had organized herself, the books with her notes in the margins, the journal she kept. She stood in the doorway of the nursery for a long time. She and Garrett had painted it together, soft gold, warm as afternoon. They had argued over the exact shade for 45 minutes in the paint store, which had ended with Garrett pretending to fall asleep standing up and Nadine laughing so hard she had to hold the paint chip card over her face. They had come home and painted together on a rainy Saturday, getting more on themselves than the walls, finishing near midnight. The room had been the color of honey. The mobile hung above the empty crib. She had found it at an estate sale 3 months ago. Little wooden animals in faded, gentle colors. She had fallen so completely in love with it that she had negotiated the price down and then felt guilty about it for a week. She reached up and took the mobile down carefully, wrapped it in a dish towel, put it in the box. I have got the crib frame, Ruth said from behind her. Okay, Nadine said. She did not cry in the nursery. She was not entirely sure why. Maybe she was saving it. Maybe she had already done that particular crying at some prior 3 in the morning and moved through to whatever was on the other side of it. They loaded Ruth's hatchback. They drove away. On the way, Nadine's phone rang. An unknown number. She almost did not answer. She answered, "Is this Nadine Whitmore?" A woman's voice said, "Careful." Almost formal. The voice of someone choosing words very deliberately. Nadine blinked. She had not been Nadine Whitmore in 7 years. "Yes," she said slowly. A brief pause. "My name is Celeste Hartman," the woman said. The car was stopped at a red light. Ruth, who heard the name clearly, turned to look at Nadine with an expression that could only be described as concerned fury. Nadine held up one hand. "Wait, why are you calling me?" Nadine asked. "Because I owe you an apology," the woman said. Her voice was tight. controlled. The voice of someone who has rehearsed something many times and is saying it anyway because not saying it has become more unbearable than saying it. And because I think there is something you need to know. Nadine said nothing. The light turned green. Ruth drove. I did not know about you at first, Celeste said. I mean, I knew he was married. He told me his marriage was over. They always say that, do they not? A small, mirthless laugh. He said you two had agreed to separate, that you were waiting for the right moment, that it was complicated because of the pregnancy. A pause. He told me the baby might not be his. Nadine's hand tightened on the phone. He said that, she said. He did, Celeste said. Something harder coming through now, something cleaner. I believed him for about 3 months. Then I started paying attention. The way he talked about you when he thought he was being casual. The timeline of things he described, which did not add up to what he had told me. The fact that his own mother started calling me her future daughter-in-law about 48 hours ago. Another pause. Patricia moves fast. She does, Nadine said. Dry. I am not trying to excuse what I did, Celeste said. I should have verified. I should have walked away the moment things felt unclear. I did not. Her voice cracked, very slightly, and then steadied. I am telling you this because he lied to me too, and you deserve to know that. And also because what? Nadine said, because there is more. About the finances. Ruth pulled into her parking garage, cut the engine. Neither of them moved to get out. Tell me, Nadine said. The story came out in pieces. Garrett had, over the past year, moved significant assets from joint accounts, quietly, incrementally, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Celeste knew because he had mentioned account numbers, figures she had seen on documents in his home office, which she had been invited to use, which she had not been supposed to memorize. But she had memorized them. I wrote them down, Celeste said. After I found out what he had actually done, after Patricia's call, I sat down and I wrote down everything I remembered. Count numbers, transfer amounts, dates as best I could reconstruct them. A pause. I do not know what it means legally, but I have those numbers, if they are useful to you. Nadine sat very still. Why, she asked. Why are you giving me this? A long silence. Long enough that Nadine could hear the ambient sound on the other end, a window perhaps, street noise, the particular audio texture of a person sitting in a room deciding whether to say the true thing. Because I have a mother, Celeste said finally, and she raised me better than how I behaved these past several months. And because she stopped. I do not know you. But you are 32 weeks pregnant and his family just threw you out of your home on a Tuesday evening, and that is not right. Whatever I did or did not know at the time, that is not right. The silence stretched between them. The baby kicked. Once. Hard. Okay, Nadine said. Send me what you have. She passed the information to Vivian that same evening. Vivian read through all of it, made a series of notes, and then said 4 words. This is very useful. Nadine went back to Ruth's apartment. She ate soup. She did not tell Ruth about the $14 billion yet, because she was still organizing how to say it. She sat at the kitchen table after Ruth went to bed, the apartment quiet except for Walter's deep, resonant snoring, and she opened her journal. She wrote, I was sleeping. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. I was asleep inside my own life. Sleepwalking through a marriage that had been emptying slowly for years, pretending not to notice, because noticing required a response I was not ready to give. She stopped writing, looked at the words. Every woman who has stayed too long in something that was slowly diminishing her knows exactly what this feels like. The careful not knowing, the practiced blindness, it is not stupidity. It is a survival mechanism that eventually stops serving you. She was done surviving. She wanted to live. She kept writing. I'm awake now, she wrote. The fog is gone and I can see clearly and I am not going back. She closed the journal. She got up and reorganized Ruth's kitchen drawers at 11:45 in the evening. Just completely reorganized them. Spatulas with spatulas. Serving spoons with serving spoons, the miscellaneous drawer made orderly and sensible, everything visible, everything where it belonged. She did not know why this helped. It just did. When the world was chaos, making one small thing orderly felt like proof that order was possible, like evidence. Ruth came out at midnight in her bathrobe, took one look at the kitchen, and said, I am choosing to be flattered. I was awake, Nadine said. How is the baby, Ruth asked. Active, Nadine said. Ruth poured 2 glasses of water, handed one to Nadine, and sat down at the table. Tell me what is actually going on, she said, not the surface of it, the underneath. Nadine looked at her sister, her older sister, who had always been the practical one, the organized one, the one who drove you to the airport at 4 in the morning without asking a single question about why. I need to tell you something, Nadine said. She told her about Everett Whitmore. Ruth was quiet for a very long time after Nadine finished, the kind of quiet that is itself a response. Say the number again, Ruth said. 14.3 billion, Nadine said. Ruth looked at the ceiling, then back at her sister. And Garrett does not know, she said. No, Patricia does not know. No. Ruth picked up her water glass, set it down without drinking from it. Okay, she said. You know what I keep thinking about? What? Nadine said. That night you called me from the parking lot, Ruth said. She looked at Nadine steadily, her voice very careful now. How scared you were. How you had nothing figured out. How lost you sounded. She shook her head slowly. And the whole time, right there under the surface, was this thing you did not even know about yet. This resource. It does not fix what happened, Nadine said. No, Ruth agreed. He still did what he did. His mother still said what she said. You still have to build a life from the wreckage of one that was supposed to last forever. She paused. The money does not change that. No, Nadine said quietly. But it changes what my options look like. Yes, Ruth said. It does that. They sat in the reorganized kitchen until 1 in the morning. Then they went to bed. 3 weeks later, the news began to move. Not the inheritance. That was still contained. Still private, known only to Ruth, Vivian, and the financial advisor whose name was Martin and who had sat across from Nadine with his hands folded and said, in a voice that contained absolutely no emotion, that this was going to require some organization. What began to move was everything else. Garrett had hired a lawyer, the family lawyer, a man named Bradford who wore expensive ties and operated on the assumption that most women in distressing situations would settle quickly to avoid prolonged conflict. Bradford filed papers. He argued that the house on Elmwood Drive was the primary contention. He argued that Nadine's departure from the home constituted abandonment of the marital property. Vivian read this and made a sound that was approximately a short laugh. He left, she said, emotionally, practically, and then he arranged for his mother to deliver the message while he stood at the bottom of the staircase. She walked out of a home she still legally owns, under duress, at 32 weeks pregnant, and went to her sister's apartment for safety. This argument will not hold for 30 seconds. She was already typing. We will respond by Friday. Nadine sat in Vivian's office and felt the cold machinery of it, the legal system grinding forward on its own rhythms, documents moving like tidal forces. She had imagined divorce as something rawer, something more human and chaotic and personal. She had not anticipated how bureaucratic grief could be. She went home, which was still Ruth's apartment, and cried in the bath, a good, thorough cry, the kind that empties you completely and leaves you feeling scoured clean and strangely light. Then she made dinner and called her old colleague Margaret at the nonprofit. Still interested? Margaret asked without preamble, because Margaret never used preamble. When can I start? Nadine asked. As soon as you are ready. We kept the communications director position. We have been hoping. A pause. Honestly, Nadine, we have been hoping for 2 years. 3 months, Nadine said, after the baby. I want 3 months with her first. Done, Margaret said. Nadine hung up and sat in the quiet of Ruth's apartment, Walter at her feet, the smell of whatever she had put on the stove drifting from the kitchen, the sound of the street outside, ordinary and indifferent and good. She felt something move through her that she could not quite name. Not happiness, not yet. Something that lived next to hope. Something tentative and new, like a plant that has been in a dark room and is slowly turning its leaves toward a window. She deserved better than what had happened. She had always deserved better. She had just needed to find her way back to knowing it. The first disaster happened on a Tuesday. Nadine was at a prenatal appointment at 35 weeks. Everything was healthy. The baby was measuring well. A small, good victory that she held close on her walk back through the waiting room, through the parking garage, to her car. Her phone began vibrating insistently inside her purse. 3 missed calls from Ruth. 1 text message that said only, "Call me now." She called from the parking lot. Patricia Calloway called Mom, Ruth said. Her voice was controlled in the way that meant she was very angry and was being careful about it. She got the number from somewhere, Garrett's address book, something old. She told Mom that you fabricated the circumstances of leaving the house, that you walked out voluntarily during a dispute, and now you are trying to weaponize the pregnancy. Nadine leaned against her car door. The October air was cold. The leaves had turned while she was not paying attention, and the parking lot was littered with red and gold. She called Mom, Nadine said. She called Mom, Ruth confirmed. The baby kicked. Hard. Nadine closed her eyes and pressed her hand flat against the cold metal of the car door, solid and real. Is Mom upset? She asked. Mom is spectacular, Ruth said. Mom said, and I am quoting her directly, Patricia Calloway has less self-awareness than Walter. An involuntary laugh moved through Nadine's chest. What else? She asked. She is coming to visit, Ruth said. Next weekend, she wants to see you. Nadine felt something ache in the center of her chest. Her mother, she had not wanted to worry her, had not wanted to make this larger than it already was. Good, she said. Okay, that is good, Nadine. I am fine. I know you are fine, Ruth said, with a particular emphasis that meant I know you are fine, but you are allowed not to be. I am going to handle this, Nadine said. Not you, me. She drove back to the apartment, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote Patricia Calloway a letter. Not an email, an actual letter, on real paper, in her best handwriting. She wrote it calmly. She stated facts without embellishment. She noted that contacting her mother directly was inappropriate and would not occur again. She stated without drama or elaboration that she had retained counsel and that all future communication should be directed to Vivian's office. She signed it Nadine Louise Whitmore. Not Calloway, not anymore. She sealed it, addressed it, drove to the post office herself, dropped it in the box. Then she sat in the parking lot of the post office for a moment. 1 month ago, she had stood on those marble steps, hand raised to knock, already diminished before the door even opened, already making herself smaller in anticipation of the room she was about to enter. She was not that woman anymore. She was beginning to understand what she was instead. The legal process continued. Bradford sent more documents. Vivian responded to each one with precision and patience. Garrett's attempts at the abandonment argument failed, as Vivian had predicted. The financial discovery process began, and that was where things became interesting. The numbers Celeste had written down were accurate. Account transfers going back 11 months. The timing told its own story. He was preparing, Vivian said over the phone. This did not begin with you leaving. This began well before. Nadine sat with this for a while. There was a particular kind of pain in realizing that the betrayal was older than you knew. That while you were folding laundry and attending prenatal appointments and planning a nursery, the other person was already in the process of leaving, already making preparations, already looking forward to a life without you in it. She let herself feel the pain of that. She did not try to manage it or minimize it or turn it into something more useful. Some things are just painful. That is all they are. And then, on the other side of the feeling it, she found she could set it down. Her mother arrived on Saturday with a car full of Tupperware containers and an expression Nadine recognized from childhood. Claire Whitmore, 62 years old, had a particular look that meant, I am here to fix something. She could not fix this. But she made chicken soup and cornbread and sat at Ruth's table and listened with her full attention, the way she had always listened. Nadine felt 7 years old and 50 years old at the same time. Tell me about Garrett, Claire said, over soup. Not the ending, the beginning. So Nadine told her, from the gala registration table, from the comment about her serious eyes, from the first date and the first fight and the slow, easy settling into each other that had felt, at the time, like coming home. He was not always this person, Nadine said. She meant it as she said it. I want to be honest about that. He was kind. He could be very funny. He used to make me coffee exactly the way I liked it without being told, because he had paid attention. She turned her spoon over in the bowl. I think the kindness got buried, under his family's expectations, under the pressure of being a Calloway, under whatever he felt towards Celeste. She paused. I think he convinced himself that wanting something different made him a victim, that leaving this way was something circumstances had forced on him. Claire watched her daughter. That is a very generous reading, she said. I know, Nadine said. But I spent 7 years with him. I know what was real. And whatever he did at the end, the person I married was real too. She looked up. I want to be able to hold both things, the good and the terrible, not collapse one into the other. Claire was quiet for a long moment. That is more wisdom than I had at your age, she said. I have had time to think, Nadine said. The weekend was warm and ordinary, and exactly what she needed. Her mother helped set up a corner of Ruth's spare room as a temporary nursery. They found a changing station at a second-hand shop, hung little curtains that let in the autumn light. On Sunday evening, after dinner, Claire sat beside Nadine on the couch and took her hand. Your father and I talked about Everett, she said quietly. When you told Ruth. Nadine went still. You knew, she said. Everett's attorney contacted your father months ago, when the estate was first being organized. We did not tell you because... Claire paused because your father thought it might change things. With Garrett. The way that news sometimes changes how people behave. Nadine looked at her mother. You were protecting me, she said. We were trying to, Claire said. Maybe we should have told you sooner. Maybe you would have made different choices. Maybe, Nadine said. She thought about it honestly. Or maybe I would have married the same man and lived the same marriage and arrived at the same place just with more information going in. She turned her palm up under her mother's hand. The money is not why any of this happened. It did not cause his choices. It will not erase them. No, Claire agreed, but it gives you somewhere to stand. Nadine rested her head against her mother's shoulder. The familiar smell of her, the particular solidity of sitting next to someone who has known you your entire life. I always had somewhere to stand, Nadine said quietly. I had just forgotten. The second disaster arrived on a Wednesday 6 weeks later. Nadine had moved into a short-term rental by then. A comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she had always liked, with old oak floors and good light coming through large windows, and a park 3 blocks away where she planned to take the baby. She had hired movers to collect the rest of her belongings from Elmwood Drive. Garrett had facilitated the handover with minimum conversation. He looked, the moving company foreman told her, drawn. older somehow. She did not let herself feel too much about that. She was at the kitchen counter writing a shopping list when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The message contained a link to a local society page. The post was dated 3 days prior. It was a photograph of Patricia Calloway at a charity luncheon, smiling broadly, with a caption that described her son's new relationship with Celeste Hartman and their plans for a new beginning together. Nadine read it 3 times. Then she set the phone face down on the counter. She stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the oak tree in the backyard, its remaining leaves rattling in the November wind. They were the last holdouts, clinging. He was moving on this fast. They were already being photographed at events, already being written about as a couple, already building a new narrative, a replacement story, one in which the 7 years with Nadine were a prologue, not the main event. She waited for the fury, the burning, righteous fury that she felt she was owed. It came, it was real. She pressed her hands flat against the counter and breathed through it. Let it be there without letting it become her. Let it move through her the way weather moves through, real and present, and then passing. And then, underneath the fury, something quieter arrived, pity. Not the comfortable, superior kind, not the kind that comes from looking down on someone. The clean, clear pity of seeing someone moving very fast in a direction they think is forward. Not understanding that they have left something essential behind them, and that eventually they will realize it. She picked up her phone, blocked the number that had sent the link, then opened a new contact and called Vivienne. "I saw the photograph," Vivienne said before Nadine could speak. "I have already documented it. This actually helps us. It establishes the timeline of the relationship, which supports our argument about the financial transfers." "Good," Nadine said. "Are you all right?" Vivienne asked. "I think I am angrier than I expected," Nadine said honestly. "That is appropriate," Vivienne said. "Let yourself be angry, just do not let it make your decisions." "I know," Nadine said. "I called you before I did anything, did I not?" She heard something that might have been a smile in Vivienne's voice. "Fair point. We are in good shape. Bradford is stalling, but that is theater. How is the baby?" 2 weeks, Nadine said. "Then focus on that. Paperwork will still be here." She hung up, went to the couch, sat. She picked up her journal and wrote until the anger ran out. It took a long time, longer than she expected. But eventually she reached the end of it, and what was left underneath was something that felt, very tentatively, like clarity. She was not going to perform grief about what he was doing with his life now. She was going to be here, in this apartment, with this child she was about to meet in this particular November afternoon, and be grateful for what was real. She had spent 7 years in a marriage that had been slowly asking her to become smaller and smaller, and to not notice. She was not small now. She was going to be enormous. Eleanor Ruth Whitmore arrived on a Thursday at 4:22 in the morning, after 14 hours of labor, 2 epidurals, one nurse named Brenda who was extraordinarily calm, and one moment that Nadine would never tell anyone about. A moment near the end, when the work was at its heaviest and she had gripped the side rail of the hospital bed and thought, very clearly, "I cannot do this alone." And then she did it. Her mother was there. Ruth was there. Walter had been left with a neighbor and was reportedly very displeased about this, but would survive. Eleanor was small and furious and entirely perfect, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the room immediately, as if to announce with complete certainty, "I am here. I have arrived. Take note." Nadine held her and said nothing for a long time. There were no right words. There was only this: the weight of her, the smell of her, the utter irreversible realness of a person who had not existed 48 hours ago and now did undeniably and permanently. "Hi," she said finally. Very soft. Just the two of them in that moment, even with the room full of people. "I am your mother. We are going to figure this out together." Eleanor looked at her with the unfocused, serious intensity of all newborns and seemed, on some level, to accept this arrangement. Claire cried. Ruth took photographs. Someone brought Nadine's soup, which was cold by the time she remembered it, but she ate it anyway, all of it, because she was suddenly ravenous, and because Eleanor had apparently done that to her. Every woman who has sat in that particular exhausted, overwhelmed, terrified, enormous love after birth knows what that room feels like. The way the whole world compresses down to one small face. The way everything before becomes the before, and now is just this. Garrett arrived the following afternoon. He had called ahead through the lawyers. Nadine had said yes, he could come. She had been clear. This was not a reconciliation. But he was Eleanor's father, and she had meant what she said to Vivienne months ago about leaving that door open. He looked as drawn as she had been told. More so, in person. He had aged in 6 weeks in a way she had not anticipated. The easy confidence she had always associated with him, the Calloway confidence, the comfortable assumption that things generally worked out for him, was gone, or at least absent. He stood in the doorway of the hospital room with flowers he was clearly uncertain about having brought. "They are for you," he said. Just congratulations. Thank you, she said evenly. He looked at Eleanor in the hospital bassinet, her tiny fists curled against her cheeks. Something moved across his face, something complicated and private and real. Nadine did not try to read it. It was not hers to read. He sat in the chair she indicated. He stayed for 40 minutes. He held Eleanor once very carefully, with the particular terror of a man holding something infinitely breakable and knowing it. Eleanor looked at him with her unfocused eyes and did not cry. When he left, he paused at the door. I am sorry, he said. I know that is not enough, Nadine said. No, he nodded, seemed to absorb this. But I am not done saying it, he said. She did not respond to that. She did not need to. After he left, she sat with Eleanor in the late afternoon light coming through the hospital window, thin and golden and late. She thought about all the ways she had imagined this moment, the arrival of her first child. She had imagined it many different ways. She had never imagined it like this, alone in the most important way, held in the most important ways she needed. She was not going to perform grief about the difference. We are okay, she told Eleanor. Eleanor made a small sound, a soft, imprecise sound, perhaps the beginning of a word, perhaps just the sound of breathing in a new world. We are really okay, Nadine said. She believed it as she said it. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor ate and slept and cried and stared at the ceiling fan with the complete absorption of a person who has just discovered that the world is interesting. Which it is. Nadine slept in pieces, ate in pieces, held her life together in pieces. Ruth came every other day. Claire came the first week and stayed for 10 days. Thomas Whitmore, Nadine's father, came the second week and sat in the corner of the small nursery holding Eleanor for 2 hours with the expression of a man who has been entirely undone. She is something, he said. Yes, Nadine agreed. She is. The apartment with its oak floors and its good light became slowly a home. The way all spaces do when you put yourself fully into them, when you stop treating them as temporary and let them be the place where you actually live. 3 months. Nadine had asked for 3 months. She took them. In that time, Eleanor grew at an astonishing rate as if she had somewhere important to be, and the calendar was not moving fast enough to suit her. Nadine's rental became a home. She bought a couch she loved. The color of deep green, the weight of it right, the length of it long enough to actually lie down. She found a pediatrician she trusted completely. She discovered a diner 2 blocks away, the Elm Street Diner, that made the best breakfast she had ever eaten. Reliable and warm, where the owner learned Eleanor's name within a week. She went to therapy. Twice a week at first, then once. The therapist's name was Dr. Holloway. She was practical and kind and said things like, "You are allowed to be angry and grateful in the same breath." That is not a contradiction. That is just being human. Nadine was working on that. The divorce proceedings moved forward. Bradford stalled less than Vivian had predicted. She suspected Garrett had lost enthusiasm for the fight, or had begun receiving advice from someone other than his mother. The financial discovery confirmed what Celeste had described: the transfers, the hidden accounts, the prepared exit strategy going back nearly a year. The picture was not pretty. It was, however, financially correctable. Nadine's share of the marital assets was significant, fair by any honest measure. She did not fight for more than was fair. That was not the battle she was interested in winning. Garrett called twice during this period. Both times she answered. Both times they talked about Eleanor. Once, near the end of the second call, he said, "I think I had some kind of breakdown." I do not say that as an excuse. I say it because I have been trying to understand what happened to me. She said, I know. I have been trying to understand it too. They did not resolve anything in those calls. But they were civil. They were honest, in the limited way 2 people can be honest when they have hurt each other this profoundly. She took that as a beginning, a small one. For Eleanor's sake and for her own, she was going to leave room for beginning. On a Tuesday morning in early March, Vivian called. "The settlement is signed," Vivian said. "It is done." Nadine was feeding Eleanor, who was eating with the total focused intensity she brought to everything she did. Nadine adjusted the phone against her shoulder. "Okay," Nadine said. "You should feel good about this. The outcome is very good." "I know," Nadine said. She looked down at Eleanor. "I know it is." "There is one more thing," Vivian said. A pause. Bradford's office reached out, informally off the record. He indicated that Garrett would like to understand, when the timing is appropriate, the nature of your financial situation. He has been informed that you have significant resources of your own. Nadine was quiet for a moment. "The inheritance has become known," she said. "Partially. The estate transfer became a matter of public record last month. The full picture may become clearer over time." Vivian paused. Bradford wanted to gauge your interest in revisiting the settlement in light of... "No," Nadine said. "That was my recommendation as well," Vivian said. "The settlement is fair. It was fair when we agreed to it. The fact that I have other resources does not change what was fair between us." She shifted Eleanor to her other arm. "That is the settlement we reached, and I am keeping it." "I will communicate that," Vivian said. One more thing, Nadine said. Tell Bradford, tell Garrett that the inheritance has nothing to do with him. It is not a card I kept hidden. It is not a weapon I held back. It simply is my life. Beyond this marriage, a brief silence. I will tell him, Vivienne said. She told Ruth that evening over dinner in the kitchen. Walter was at their feet, monitoring for dropped food with the seriousness of a professional. Settlement is final, Nadine said. Ruth raised her glass of water. To you, she said. To Eleanor, Nadine said. To both of you, Ruth said. They drank. Ruth set her glass down. Patricia called me, she said. Nadine looked up. I did not tell you at the time because Eleanor was a week old and I was not going to add to anything. Ruth turned her fork over on the plate. She wanted to arrange a visit to see the baby. Nadine said nothing. I told her I would pass along the information, Ruth said, that it was your decision. Nadine thought about Patricia, about the marble foyer and the white lilies and the tilt of her chin and the words "we are asking you to be reasonable," delivered from the doorway of a house that had never truly felt like home. She thought about a woman who had likely spent her own marriage learning to manage it through control and had passed that education along to her son without realizing it, because it was the only language she had been given. She did not like Patricia Calloway. She suspected she never would. But Eleanor would one day want to know her grandmother, would one day have questions, would one day form her own opinions about who her father's family was and what they meant to her. Tell her she can call me directly, Nadine said. Ruth blinked. Really? I am not doing it for Patricia, Nadine said. I am not doing it for Garrett. I am doing it for Eleanor. Because Eleanor deserves to make her own decisions about her own family when she is old enough to make them. She looked at her hands on the table. And I am doing it because I do not want to be the kind of person who lets old pain make new rules. Ruth was quiet for a moment. When did you get this wise, she asked. Slowly, Nadine said, and expensively. On a Saturday in the same month, Dr. Holloway said something in their session that Nadine wrote down immediately after, on a napkin in the parking lot, because she did not want to lose it. Dr. Holloway said, the part of you that stayed too long was not the weak part. It was the part that believed in the thing and kept trying. The work is not to punish that part. The work is to teach it what to try for next time. Nadine read that sentence 7 times. Then she folded the napkin carefully and put it in her wallet. Spring came. Eleanor discovered her own hands, then her own feet, then the particular, inexplicable joy of watching the kitchen faucet run. She was interested in everything with an intensity that seemed to Nadine like a comment on the world itself. This is interesting, her expression said constantly. I would like more of this. Nadine went back to work in April. The nonprofit was different from when she had left it. Larger, more organized. They had grown these 4 years in ways she had helped build and then been absent from. She sat in her first staff meeting, communications director, the title on her folder, the job she had left and was now reclaiming, and felt something she had almost forgotten. Competence, not the performance of it, the real thing. The feeling of sitting in a room where you know what you are doing and why. Where your presence is not something you are auditioning for, but something already established and simply resuming. She had been good at this. She had forgotten how much she had been good at this. She was going to be better. She began working with the estate attorneys on a philanthropic structure. The foundation would take time to build properly. She was not in a hurry. $14.3 billion was a responsibility she intended to take seriously. Climate initiatives, early childhood education, maternal health programs, particularly in underserved communities. She had ideas. She had always had ideas. She had just been somewhere for a long time that treated her ideas as secondary at best. She hired a woman named Sandra as her household manager. Not a housekeeper exactly, but an organizer of logistics, a keeper of calendars, a person who made sure the 1,000 small mechanical requirements of a life were handled so that the larger things could have her full attention. Nadine had learned, slowly and at some cost, that running a household and a career in a philanthropy and a new life simultaneously required support. Asking for support was not weakness. She had had to learn that. Slowly, Dr. Holloway helped. Celeste Hartman sent a baby gift in February, a soft yellow blanket, handmade, clearly made with care, a card that said only, I hope she is healthy and happy. Wishing you well. Nadine had looked at the blanket for a long time, set it in Eleanor's drawer, not in the back, not hidden. Just there, among the other soft things, where Eleanor could use it if she chose. She could not make simple sense of Celeste as a character in this story. She could not decide what she felt about her. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was not warmth. It was something more like acknowledgement, that the world was more complicated than it looked from the outside. That people made bad choices and sometimes tried afterward to correct for them. That the simplest stories were rarely the truest ones. She was not in a simple story. She was in a complicated human one. She was learning to live in it without needing it to resolve into something cleaner. On a Sunday in June, when Eleanor was nearly 7 months old and could sit up on her own and was very proud of this achievement, Nadine's father came to visit. Thomas Whitmore sat in Nadine's new living room with Eleanor in his lap and looked slowly around at the space she had made, the couch she loved, the books organized just so, the photographs on the wall, the ones of herself and Ruth and her parents and Eleanor, alongside the one photo she had kept of Garrett, holding Eleanor in the hospital. His face soft with something she chose to believe was real. "You like it here," Thomas said. Observation, not question. "I do," she said. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor examined his face with the concentrated attention she gave to everything she found interesting. She reached out and pressed her palm against his cheek. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Nadine looked up. "For not telling you about Everett sooner." He did not look away from Eleanor. "We thought we were protecting you from the way money changes things, the way it changes how people look at you." He paused. "But we made that choice for you, and you are a grown woman. It was not ours to make." Nadine considered this for a moment. "It is okay," she said. "Nadine, Dad." She moved to sit next to him on the couch. "I am not saying that to make you feel better. I am saying it because I genuinely believe that everything that happened, even the hard parts, led me here, to this apartment, to this job. To this," she gestured at Eleanor, who had grabbed her grandfather's thumb with total determination, "to this person." She looked at him. "I do not know if I would have found my way back to myself if everything had stayed comfortable. Maybe I needed the disruption to remember who I was." Her father held her gaze. "You sound like Everett," he said. "He used to say, the comfortable life rarely requires you to find out what you are made of." "Smart man," Nadine said. "Very." Thomas, he looked at Eleanor, still holding his thumb, apparently committed to this project indefinitely. He would have liked her. "I think so too," Nadine said. They sat in the afternoon light, the three of them, and the room was very quiet in the best possible way. July arrived with its particular heat, the kind that settles into old buildings and stays there, and Nadine bought a standing fan for Eleanor's room and window boxes for the kitchen sill and planted basil and mint that grew with great enthusiasm. Garrett called on a Sunday afternoon when Eleanor was napping, Nadine answered. Walked to the kitchen window, which had become her thinking place, the place she stood when she needed to let her mind settle into something. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, "and I am going to say it badly. But I am going to say it anyway." She waited. "My mother told me about the inheritance," he said. "She told me 2 weeks ago. She heard about it from someone at the Hartman firm." A pause. "She was angry that you had not disclosed it during the settlement process." Nadine said nothing. Outside the window, the oak tree moved in the summer air. Its leaves were dark green and full and generous. "I told her the settlement was fair," he said, "that what you had outside our marriage was not relevant to what was fair between us." He was quiet. "She disagreed with me, strongly." "I imagine she did," Nadine said. "I also told her I would not be calling to reopen the settlement." Nadine turned from the window. "Because she is correct that I have no grounds," he continued, "and because even if I did, I would not. Because I am trying," another pause, longer this time. "I am trying to become a person I could respect. I do not know if that process ends anywhere useful. But it has to start somewhere." She said nothing. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I am not even asking you to believe me. I just wanted you to know." She looked at the oak tree for a long moment, at its leaves, at the way the light came through them and made patterns on the kitchen floor. "I believe you," she said finally. He exhaled, long and unsteady. "I do not know what that means yet," she said. "But I believe you. How is Eleanor?" he asked. "Growing like a weed," Nadine said. "She has your ears," a sound she had not expected. A laugh, small, genuine. "God help her," he said. "She is beautiful," Nadine said. "Come Sunday. Bring something small. She is in a receiving phase. She will accept anything." "Okay," he said. "Okay, I will." She hung up and stood at the window. She was not going to pretend this was repaired. It was not. Maybe it never fully would be. Maybe what they were building now, co-parents if not partners, civil if not warm, people who shared a child and tried to do right by her, maybe that was the best possible version of what they could become. And maybe that was enough. She had spent 7 years waiting for something to become what she needed it to be. She was not going to spend the rest of her life doing that. She was going to let things be what they were. Make them as good as they could actually be. Find her joy in the real thing, not in the imagined version of it. She was 41 years old. She had a daughter who was almost 8 months old and could pull herself to standing by gripping the coffee table and thought this was the greatest achievement in the history of human civilization. She had a job she loved, a foundation she was building, a sister 2 miles away who was her best friend and always had been, parents who drove 4 hours without being asked, a basset hound who was not technically hers but had decided otherwise, and that was simply that. She had $14 billion and the practical sense to understand that money is infrastructure, not identity. It is what you build on. It is not who you are, and she had herself. The woman she had almost let disappear inside someone else's expectations of who she should be. She was still finding out what she was made of. She suspected she would be finding out for a long time. She thought she was okay with that. The Foundation's inaugural board meeting was held in late September, almost exactly 1 year from the night she had stood on Patricia Calloway's marble steps with her hand raised to knock. The boardroom was clean and well lit and smelled like new carpet and good coffee. The board was 5 people she had chosen carefully over many months. An environmental scientist named Dr. Patricia Rivers, who had published research on climate impact in coastal communities and who took no nonsense from anyone. A public school superintendent named Martin Okafor, who had spent 30 years inside American public education and had opinions about all of it, and was right about most of them. A maternal health physician named Dr. Sarah Brennan, who ran a clinic in Western Maryland and had been doing it for 22 years and showed no signs of stopping. A nonprofit governance expert named Gerald Fitch, who was 68 years old and had seen every possible way a foundation could go wrong and was committed to preventing all of them. And Ruth. Ruth had accepted the invitation with one condition, that she could bring Walter to the office on Fridays, approved unanimously. Nadine sat at the head of the table and looked at the 5 people she had invited into this work. The weight of it settled around her, not heavily, not oppressively, more like something she had chosen to wear, a cloak she had put on deliberately. "We are here," she said, "to figure out how to do something useful. I am not interested in legacy. I am not interested in monuments or naming rights or being seen to do good work. I am interested in what actually helps people." She looked around the table. "I imagine there will be arguments. I hope there will be arguments. I trust the people in this room to have them honestly." Ruth was smiling, trying not to. The environmental scientist was making notes. The superintendent was nodding. Dr. Brennan was looking at the agenda with an expression that meant she had questions already and would ask them in approximately 2 minutes. "Good. Let us begin," Nadine said. There was one moment, near the end of that first meeting, when the room went quiet while someone retrieved a document. Nadine sat at the head of the table and looked at her hands, the same hands that had rested on the steering wheel of her car in a dark parking lot, the same hands that had written that letter to Patricia Calloway on real paper in good handwriting, the same hands that had held Eleanor at 4:22 in the morning and said, "I am your mother," and meant it completely. She had been so afraid that night in the parking lot. She had thought she had nothing. She had been wrong in such a specific and interesting way. She had always had herself. She had just been somewhere that made it very difficult to remember that. It is a quiet Thursday in October when this story settles into its ending, or rather when this chapter ends. Because Nadine Whitmore has learned painfully and beautifully and at enormous cost that life does not end in chapters. It simply continues, the way rivers do. Finding new channels, moving around what is fixed, making things smooth over time. Eleanor is 14 months old. She is walking, now running, nearly, with the particular determined wobble of a child who has recently discovered locomotion and intends to use it continuously until further notice. She has opinions about her shoes. She is developing opinions about everything. She has her grandfather Thomas's nose and her father's ears and her own eyes, dark and focused and alive with everything they see. She calls Ruth Rue. Ruth pretends not to be overcome by this. She is not very convincing. Walter has accepted the name from Eleanor, which Ruth says should be documented as a notable event in the Basset Hound's history. The foundation has approved its first round of grants. 11 organizations, 4 states, work that matters. Nadine attended the first site visit in September, a maternal health clinic in West Virginia, and stood in the waiting room and watched the way the staff moved through the space, competent and purposeful and tired in the way that meaningful work makes you tired. She thought, "This is good. This is real. This makes a difference." She wants to do more of that. She plans to. Her life is full in a way she had almost stopped believing it could be. Not because the hard things did not happen. They did. Not because the loss was not real. It was. But because she chose, every day and then less effortfully over time, to be in the life she actually had rather than mourning the life she had planned. She thinks sometimes about the night she sat in her car in the Garden Center parking lot, the October dark, the dashboard clock reading 7:43, the nowhere to go. She does not regret that night. Or rather, she regrets the years before it, the slow erosion of herself, the choices she made out of fear rather than love, the ways she made herself smaller to fit a space that was never built to hold her. She regrets all of that. But the night in the parking lot, the very bottom of it, she does not regret, because the bottom is where she hit bedrock. She had always been standing on bedrock. She just needed to feel the ground under her feet to know it was there. Patricia Calloway came to meet Eleanor in November. The year before, when Eleanor was just 3 months old and still had that particular newborn quality of looking at the world as if unsure whether it was worth her time. Patricia was stilted, careful, dressed for an occasion rather than for a visit, which told its own small story. She brought expensive gifts that Eleanor examined and then set aside in favor of the tissue paper, which was the correct choice. Patricia said very little about the previous year's events. Nadine offered coffee, showed her the apartment. Let Eleanor conduct her own assessment of the visitor, which Eleanor did with the complete seriousness she brought to assessments. When Patricia left, she paused at the door. "You have done well," she said, as if this surprised her, as if it was a concession she had to make against her will. "Yes," Nadine said simply. "I have," Patricia nodded, left. Nadine closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. She was not angry, she was not warm, she was simply clear. There was a boundary between them, as real and firm as the marble steps she had once stood on, waiting to be let into a place she now understood she had never quite belonged. She belonged here. In the apartment with the oak tree and the good light and Eleanor's fingerprints on the glass coffee table that Nadine kept forgetting to wipe off. Then decided after a while that she did not want to wipe off. Not yet. Not while Eleanor was still this size, this age, this particular version of herself. In the spring, she had a conversation with a woman at Eleanor's music class. Eleanor had started a parent and baby music class in March, where small children sat on foam circles and hit small tambourines, and seemed to find this deeply satisfying. Eleanor loved it with the passionate, total love she brought to all new experiences. The woman was 43, newly separated. She was wearing the particular expression of someone holding themselves together through force of will alone, barely held together, the seams showing if you knew where to look. She made a small joke about starting over, then looked away quickly, as if she regretted saying it. Nadine recognized that expression. She had worn it. She had worn it for a long time before she even knew she was wearing it. "Can I ask you something?" she said during snack time, while Eleanor demolished a cracker with great seriousness. The woman looked at her, cautious, expecting advice or reassurance or cheerful reassurance that things always work out. "What is the hardest part right now?" Nadine asked. "Actually, not the surface of it." Something in the woman's face shifted. She had not been asked that. She had been given answers, perhaps, and suggestions, and examples of people who had come through things like this and been fine. But she had not been asked to name the actual hard thing. "I do not know who I am," the woman said. "Without the life I was building, I gave so much of myself to it, and now it is gone, and I do not know what is left." Nadine thought about this. Not about the right thing to say, about the true thing. "I know that feeling," she said. "I had it, for a long time." She looked at Eleanor, who was offering half a cracker to the child next to her, because Eleanor was constitutionally generous, had been since the beginning. "What I can tell you, and I know this sounds like something people say, I know it sounds like a thing on a coffee mug, but what I can tell you is that person is still there. She is still exactly where you left her. You just cannot see her yet because you are still in the middle." The woman was quiet. "The middle," Nadine said, "is the hardest place to be, because you cannot see either shore." "How long does the middle last?" the woman asked. Nadine considered this honestly. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough that it seems like it will not end, and then one day you look up and you are on the other side." The woman looked at Eleanor. "She is beautiful," she said. "She is," Nadine said. They sat in the small music room with the foam circles and the tambourines, and it was ordinary and specific and just exactly what it was. The prison door, Nadine thinks sometimes, was always unlocked. She had walked in freely, had learned to call the walls her home, had stopped noticing the door was there. It was not Garrett who imprisoned her. It was not Patricia. It was not the Calloway family and their marble floors and their particular expectations. It was her own fear, her own habit of making herself small so as not to disturb the comfort of others. Her own practiced blindness toward the things she did not yet have the courage to see. The hardest part, she had written in her journal a year ago, is admitting that I knew. I knew all along. I just chose for a very long time not to. Both things were true. She had known and she had chosen not to know. Holding both those truths simultaneously, without collapsing one into the other, without making herself a villain or a victim of her own story, had taken the better part of 18 months and most of Dr. Holloway's patience. She had gotten there. She was still getting there. It was an ongoing process. But she was on the path and she was moving in the right direction, and that was enough for a Thursday in October. On this Thursday in October, Eleanor is on her hip. The morning is bright. The oak tree in the backyard has gone full October color, red and gold and amber, the colors of things changing into their truest form. Nadine stands at her kitchen window drinking coffee. Eleanor puts her hand flat against the glass. "Pretty," she says. She has perhaps 40 words now. She is deliberate in her use of them, this child. Every word she says she means. "Yes," Nadine says. "Very pretty." They stand there for a moment. Her and this person she made, watching the leaves move. The phone is on the counter. There are 47 unread emails. There is a board meeting this afternoon. A pediatric appointment on Friday. A call with the Foundation's legal team next Monday about the second grant cycle. A dinner with Ruth on Saturday at the Elm Street Diner, 2 blocks away, which has become a tradition without anyone formally deciding to make it one. There is a life here, a full one, a real one. Not the life she planned, the life she built. She built it out of the wreckage of the one that fell, with her own hands and her own choices, and the people who showed up to help her hold the boards in place while the glue dried. She built it slowly and imperfectly, and with false starts and corrections, and one Thursday afternoon, when she sat in Dr. Holloway's office and said, "I do not know if I am doing any of this right." And Dr. Holloway said, "Doing it is already doing it right." She built it for Eleanor, and for herself, mostly for herself, because she had spent long enough building things for other people, toward other people's visions of what she should be, and it was time. It was past time. It was time to build something that was entirely and unapologetically hers. "Okay," she tells Eleanor, "shall we?" Eleanor turns from the window with the complete serious attention she gives to everything. Okay, Eleanor agrees. They go. What the story taught, if it taught anything, a marriage is not a destination. It is a practice. And sometimes the most important thing you can practice is knowing when you have been practicing the wrong thing for too long. Knowing when to stop. Knowing when the kindest thing you can do for yourself, and paradoxically for everyone else, is to walk out the door and not come back. Wealth is not identity. Resources give you options. Character determines what you do with them. The inheritance did not save Nadine. Nadine saved Nadine. The inheritance gave her more room to do it. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. Anger is not the enemy. Anger is information. It tells you where your values live, what you cannot accept, what matters enough to fight for. The skill is not in suppressing it. The skill is in using it without being used by it. Forgiveness is not a gift to the person who wronged you. It is a door you open so you are not trapped in the room with what hurt you. So the hurt is in the past, where it belongs, and you are in the present, where the living is. The middle is the hardest place to be, but it ends. It ends. And what comes after, if you do the work, if you stay honest, if you let yourself be seen by the people who love you, and let them in when you are afraid, and let yourself be held, and also let yourself be fierce, what comes after can be the best thing you never planned. The most interesting life, the truest one, the one that is entirely, finally yours. Eleanor Whitmore, at 14 months old, thinks the world is interesting and is correct. Her mother agrees. That is enough. That is more than enough.